So doing an interview is always going to be a stressful situation for you, but this is all the more so if you're doing the interview in a foreign language. So in this video, I've gathered 5 pieces of advice that I try to apply on my own whenever I'm interviewing in a foreign language. So if you're also preparing an interview in a language that is not your own, then stay tuned. Hi, I'm Julian and welcome to my channel where I speak about language learning. So I'm currently looking for a job, and so in the last few weeks I've done a few interviews in languages that were neither my mother tongue nor English, which means that I had to do them in languages where I didn't feel extremely comfortable with. So after making a few mistakes in some of those interviews because I was speaking in a language I didn't feel super comfortable with, I decided to sit down and reflect upon my mistakes. And after doing that, I came up with a series of advice that I thought would be very helpful for someone who is also preparing for this type of situation, right? For an interview in a language they don't know extremely well. So the first piece of advice is that you should prepare to feel uncomfortable. So interviews are always challenging processes, right? Stressful situations. But that's even more so if you're doing the interview in a language you don't really know that well. That might be because at some point you might not fully understand what the interviewer is saying, or that might be because you get stuck at a certain word and then you get a little bit more nervous than usual, right? So I think it's important to have this in mind before the interview. It's important to know, okay, this interview is going to get me a little bit more nervous than usual, maybe more than a little bit more nervous, right? So I should be able to control myself, right? So if I know that that's going to be the case, I'm more likely to stay calm under that situation. Because if not, if I just expect it to be a normal interview and then I just go there with that mindset, and then at some point I started getting very nervous because I get stuck or because whatever thing happens, right? Then I might lose control, right? I'm more likely to lose control if I'm not prepared for that. But if I know, okay, I'm gonna get more nervous than usual, it's gonna be fine, just try to stay calm under that situation, then once that moment comes, you are gonna be more likely to handle that situation, right? So that was my first point. Now, the second one is also related to mental preparedness. But in this case, I'd like you to prepare yourself for not being perfect, right? So when we do an interview, we want to express ourselves in the best way possible, right? With elegant language, let's say, or not messing it up with the language, right? So saying everything in a clear structure and yeah, basically expressing our thoughts in a clear way. The thing is that if you're speaking in a language where you are at a sort of B2 level, then at some point you are not going to be perfect, right? It is going to happen. Like you are going to say the wrong word at some point, or you might not recall how to say a certain thing in the language, or you're just gonna mess it up with the structure of the sentences, right? And you're gonna be aware of that, right? At some point, you're gonna be like, I think I'm messing it up here. Like while speaking, you're gonna start thinking and doubting yourself, like, am I saying the right word? I'm probably messing it up, right? All of this while speaking. And the thing is, you should be okay with that feeling. So here, I'd like to tie it back to what I said before, right? If you know that this is going to happen, if you are prepared for it, if you know that at some point you're gonna make mistakes and you're gonna be aware that you're making mistakes, then you're less likely to fall under stress, right? To succumb to the stress. You're more likely to stay calm in that situation, to be like, okay, I might be messing it up, but I'm gonna continue talking. Nothing has happened, or I will make as if nothing has happened, right? So if you manage to stay confident, or at least show a certain degree of confidence, even if you're messing it up, I think this is positive, as long as you are not, I mean, if you are messing it up completely with the language and saying something really wrong that the other person doesn't understand, then obviously not. But if you're just making small, tiny mistakes, and in those moments, instead of doubting yourself, you just continue going and don't get nervous by it, then this is going to help you a lot in the interview, because you're going to stay calmer, even when you make small mistakes in the language, right? So this is the whole idea of this second point, like be prepared for those moments because they're going to happen, and just keep going, maintain the confidence, and just stay calm. So the third piece of advice is to mentally prepare again for not understanding 100% of what the interviewer is saying. So again, if you find yourself at a B2/C1 level, then at some point in the interview, it's likely that the interviewer will say something that you will not fully understand. There might be a word there you never heard, or because the interviewer has a certain accent, then you just didn't recognize the word, or because the interviewer is speaking very quickly and is a native speaker, all of these things can happen. So you have to be mentally prepared for that situation. You can't be like, shit, oh my God, the interviewer said something I didn't understand. You cannot fall prey of the nerves in these situations. So you have to stay calm again and only ask for clarification if the word you didn't understand was actually a very important word of the sentence. But obviously, if it wasn't like an essential part of the sentence, and if you already got like the question they are asking you, then obviously don't ask for clarification. Like only ask for clarification when needed. So obviously you might have to do this at some point because you don't know the language very well. So maybe at some point you'll have to just maybe repeat the question. This is something I do every now and then. Like I repeat the question in my own words if I'm not 100% sure of what the other person meant in order to get the confirmation, right? If the other person, if the interviewer confirms, then I reply. So this is something you might do every now and then, I guess, but obviously you cannot use the card of repeating the question many times because then the interviewer is going to think like the other person is always doubting what I'm asking or is not getting what I'm asking, right? So you want to be mindful about this. You want to, as I said, like be mentally prepared for these situations where you won't understand what you're being asked, but at the same time, you need to know how to deal with these situations. So as I said, I try to stay calm as much as possible, but if the interviewer said something I really struggle to understand, then I might ask them to repeat what they said, or I might rephrase it in my own words, which I think is a better way of doing it. But in any case, that's what I try to do, but I try not to do this in excess. So yeah, this is the whole point, like be mentally prepared for not understanding. And in case that happens, just repeat what they said and make sure you got the question. All right, so my fourth point today is that you should feel comfortable speaking slower than usual. So the thing is, when you speak in a foreign language, you are going to, in general, speak slower than in your mother tongue, right? This is because sometimes you have to think of the words that you need in that moment. That is because you need to articulate a little bit better in order to utter the words properly. Or that might be because, the language just doesn't come as naturally to you as your mother tongue. That's quite obvious. So here again, I believe it's important to be mentally prepared for it. So if you go in the interview knowing that you're going to speak slower than usual, and you accept that, then you're less likely, yet again, to get nervous or to fall prey of your nerves. So let me illustrate this with an example. So you're used to speaking quickly in your mother tongue or in English whenever you do interviews or in general, right? But on this day, you have to do the interview in a foreign language because you want to move to a certain country, for example. So you're used to answering the questions of the interviewer at a rather quick pace. However, when you get to the interview and start answering the questions, you will feel that you are speaking slower than usual. Like that's probably going to be an effect of the nerves, but that's also because you're speaking in a foreign language, right? But the thing is, if you're not mentally prepared for it, then you might get into a vicious circle where you start getting more and more nervous, right? So you start speaking and you notice that you are not speaking very quickly and that you're kind of struggling with the language and that sometimes you have to think of the word. And if you don't know in advance that this is going to happen, if you're not prepared for this feeling, then you are going to start getting more and more nervous. I'm saying this because this is something that has happened to me. So before the interview, I kind of try to accept that I'm going to speak a little bit slower than usual, slower than how I speak in other languages. And that should be fine. Like, the interviewer probably knows that I'm not speaking in my mother tongue, and he or she should accept that. I mean, as long as I don't speak extremely slowly, as long as I speak at a more or less natural pace, then that should be fine with the interviewer. But like, in the moment, if you are not ready for it and you start speaking slowly and you start missing some words, and you're gonna start getting nervous and this starts accumulating and so on. And this is what you want to avoid by just being mentally prepared for it. All right, so my fifth tip is to rehearse a lot. So this is probably a good advice for any sort of interview you do, regardless of the language that you're gonna use, right? But in these cases we're talking about today, it is an even more important step. So it's important to rehearse and to take that time to write down the words that you didn't know in the language you're gonna use, and to try to assimilate them, to integrate them, to know them well in order to use them naturally when you talk about your resume or when you explain certain anecdotes, certain experiences from your job that are most likely going to show up. So the thing is, if you don't rehearse properly, then you might go to the interview and at some point you might get stuck in a word that you should have known because it was expected to be asked that question, but since you didn't rehearse properly, you didn't notice that you were going to have to use that word that you felt unsure about at that point. So if this situation happened once, and then if it happens again later on, you're gonna start feeling more and more nervous. And this is something that you want to avoid, and something you probably could have avoided if you had rehearsed properly and if you had tried to really learn these few words that were going to be important at the time of the interview in order to convey your message properly. But at the same time, you want to be careful not to just memorize sentences in that foreign language and then just try to spit them out word by word, right? Because at some point you'll have to improvise. At some point they'll ask you something that you hadn't prepared for, and thus you have to have this ability of just speaking, right? So what you want to do, what would probably be a good idea, is to get a buddy, a partner that can help you in the foreign language. I mean, I know that this is difficult to do, but there's probably some apps or some websites out there that can help you find someone who can just run you through an interview or simulate an interview for 30 minutes and maybe give you some pieces of advice. Or if not, you probably have a friend who speaks the foreign language, right? But you want to make sure that you not only rehearse alone and take the time to search for the words that you should include in some of the answers, and also to take the time of actually simulating an interview and answering to questions impromptu. All right, and my final piece of advice is that you should frame all of this challenging interview process in a foreign language as a challenge and as an enjoyable challenge, rather than as something that is going to take a lot of effort and that is cumbersome and that it's just going to be a nuisance, right? So the thing is, if you want to succeed in the interview and if you want to get the job in this other country you're applying to or whatever, you need to be good in the foreign language, right? You need to feel comfortable in that language. And the thing is, if you don't approach this with the right mindset, if you don't approach this thinking, oh cool, this is exciting, I've never done interviews in this other language, I know it's going to be difficult, I know I'm going to suffer, but it's going to be an enjoyable experience that is going to allow me to learn the foreign language better. If you don't do this, if you don't have this mindset, if you think, oh my God, yet again, I have to interview in this language I don't enjoy, or in this language I don't feel very comfortable speaking, then with this second mindset, you're less likely to overcome the hurdle and to get better at the language, because you're not going to be motivated to put in more hours and to learn more about the language and so on. Thus, you are more likely to stay at that intermediate level, right? To not get good and comfortable speaking in that foreign language. So I think that approaching this interviewing process with the right mindset is super important, is crucial in order to get the job, right? Because with the right mindset, you're gonna be motivated to go through the process, even though it's challenging. And thus you're gonna put in more hours in order to properly prepare. And eventually you're not only going to get the job, or you're going to be more likely to get the job, but you're also going to improve your skills in the language. Like, you're more likely to improve them in a more significant way. And thus the next time you have to interview in that other language, you are going to feel more comfortable as well, right? All right, so those were the 6 pieces of advice I came up with. I hope they can help you in your next interview if you're interviewing in a foreign language. All right, thank you, and see you next time.